Welcome to English Learning Podcast, and welcome to what I believe will be one of our most challenging and rewarding listening practice sessions yet. I'm Taylor, and this is episode 82, specifically designed for intermediate English learners ready to push their comprehension skills to the next level. Today, we're diving deep into real-world English as it's actually spoken in professional, academic, and social contexts. This isn't simplified learner English. This is authentic, natural speech that will challenge your listening comprehension while building the skills you need for genuine fluency. Over the next hour, you'll encounter the kind of English you'll actually need in real situations: business meetings with multiple speakers, academic lectures with complex ideas, informal conversations with cultural references, and debates where people interrupt and overlap. This is intermediate English in action. I want to be transparent about today's challenge level. You might not catch every word, and that's not just okay. It's the point. Real listening comprehension isn't about understanding every single word. It's about extracting meaning, following arguments, and staying engaged even when some details slip by. We'll explore 3 distinct listening environments today. First, professional scenarios, including a team meeting, a conference call, and a networking conversation. Then, academic content, featuring a university lecture and a student discussion group. Finally, social and cultural contexts, with a dinner party conversation and a podcast discussion. Each section will challenge different aspects of your listening skills, from following rapid exchanges between multiple speakers to understanding implied meanings and cultural references. After each segment, I'll highlight key phrases, pronunciation patterns, and comprehension strategies. Remember, this is practice for the English you'll encounter in real life. It's supposed to feel challenging. Your goal isn't perfect comprehension, it's active engagement and continuous improvement. Let's begin your journey to mastering intermediate English listening skills. Business team meeting. First, let's listen to a team meeting at a marketing agency. Pay attention to how multiple speakers interrupt, build on each other's ideas, and use professional jargon naturally. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining today's strategy session. I know we're all juggling multiple projects, but we need to nail down our approach for the Peterson campaign before Friday's deadline. Speaking of deadlines, are we still on track with the creative assets? Because honestly, the client's been breathing down our necks about the visual concepts. That's exactly what I wanted to address. Peterson called again this morning. They're getting cold feet about the direction we're taking. Apparently, their board thinks our approach is too edgy for their brand identity. Interesting. Can you elaborate on what they mean by edgy? Because if I remember correctly, they specifically requested something that would help them break into younger demographics. Right, that's the whole point of our strategy. You can't appeal to millennials and Gen Z with the same conservative approach that worked 10 years ago. The market's completely shifted. Actually, Mike, the data supports that. Our research shows that 73% of their target demographic responds positively to authentic, somewhat provocative messaging. But Lisa's point about the board is valid. There's often a disconnect between what the data suggests and what decision makers are comfortable with. Exactly, Carlos. And here's the thing. We can have the most brilliant campaign in the world, but if the client doesn't buy in, we're dead in the water. Okay, let's take a step back. What if we present them with 2 options? A slightly more conservative version that keeps the board happy, and our original concept that truly targets their desired demographic. That could work, but it doubles our workload. We're already stretched thin as it is. Actually, I think Sarah's onto something. We could position it as A/B testing options. That way, it looks strategic rather than like we're backtracking. I like that approach. We could even propose running both versions in different markets to see which performs better. That gives them data-driven validation for either direction. Perfect. Mike, how long would you need to develop the alternative creative direction? If we're talking about toning down the existing concept rather than starting from scratch, maybe 2 days. But I'll need Lisa to clarify exactly what their concerns are. I'll set up a call with Peterson this afternoon to get specifics. The last thing we want is to guess wrong and have to pivot again. Great. Carlos, can you pull together some additional market research that supports both approaches? That way, we're covering all our bases. Absolutely. I'll have preliminary findings by tomorrow morning. Excellent. This actually positions us really well. We're showing flexibility while maintaining our strategic expertise. All right. Any other pressing issues before we wrap up? Notice how natural the interruptions and collaborative building of ideas felt? This is typical professional English. Ideas develop through dialogue rather than formal presentations. Now let's listen to a conference call between team members in different countries. Notice how they navigate technical issues, cultural differences, and varying English accents. Jennifer, New York. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to our London team, and good evening to our Singapore colleagues. Can everyone hear me clearly? Yes, crystal clear from Singapore. Loud and clear from London, though I think David might be having connection issues. Sorry about that. I'm here now. Had to switch to my mobile hotspot. Our office Wi-Fi's been unreliable all week. No worries, David. All right, let's dive into our quarterly review. First on the agenda is the Asia-Pacific expansion timeline. Raj, you've been leading this initiative. What's the current status? Thanks, Jennifer. Overall, we're making solid progress, though we've hit a few unexpected roadblocks. The regulatory approval process in Thailand is taking longer than anticipated. Apparently, there's been a recent change in foreign investment policies that's affecting our timeline. That's concerning. How significant is the delay we're looking at? Potentially 6 to 8 weeks beyond our original projections. However, I've been working with our local legal team, and they think there might be an alternative pathway that could expedite the process. Raj, from a product localization standpoint, could this delay actually work in our favor? We've been struggling with the Thai language interface, and this gives us additional time to refine it. That's a brilliant point, David. Actually, yes. Our user testing revealed some cultural nuances we hadn't considered. More time could definitely improve our market entry strategy. Interesting perspective. What kind of cultural nuances are we talking about? Well, for instance, our color scheme apparently has some negative connotations in traditional Thai culture, and our notification system was perceived as too aggressive. Thai users prefer much more subtle prompts. This is exactly why our phased rollout strategy makes sense. Better to get it right than rush to market and damage our brand reputation. Absolutely. Raj, what's your recommendation for communicating this timeline shift to the board? I suggest we frame it as a strategic optimization rather than a delay. We're using this additional time to ensure cultural alignment and regulatory compliance, both of which are crucial for long-term success in the Thai market. That's smart positioning, and honestly, the board will appreciate our thoroughness, especially given the competitive landscape in Southeast Asia. Speaking of competition, have we seen any movement from TechFlow since their Seoul launch? Good question. Our market intelligence suggests they're facing their own challenges with local adaptation. Their user acquisition costs in Korea are reportedly 40% higher than projected. That actually validates our approach. Taking time to understand local markets properly seems to be paying dividends for companies that invest in it. Agreed. Should we schedule a follow-up call next week to review the alternative regulatory pathway? Let's do that. Raj, can you coordinate with our legal team and have preliminary findings ready by Thursday? Absolutely. I'll send out calendar invites after this call. Perfect. And I'll have the updated localization timeline ready by then as well. Excellent work, everyone. Any other urgent items before we close out? Brief pause. Nothing urgent from London. All good from Singapore. Same here. Great. Great. Thanks everyone for your flexibility with the scheduling. Talk to you all next week. Notice how they handled the technical difficulties naturally, built on each other's ideas, and maintained professionalism despite the challenges. This is real business English in action. Finally, let's eavesdrop on a conversation at a professional networking event. Pay attention to how people introduce themselves, make small talk, and gradually transition to business topics. Excuse me, aren't you the keynote speaker from this morning's session? Your presentation on digital transformation was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. That's very kind of you to say. I'm Patricia Chen, and I have to admit, I'm still buzzing from the energy in that room. The audience was incredibly engaged. I'm Alex Rodriguez. I'm actually implementing some similar strategies at my company, though admittedly on a much smaller scale. Your point about change management resonated particularly strongly with me. Oh, how interesting. What industry are you in, if you don't mind me asking? Financial services. We're a mid-sized firm trying to modernize our client interaction systems, but we're discovering that the human element is far more challenging than the technology itself. That's exactly what I was getting at this morning. 70% of digital transformation initiatives fail not because of technical issues, but because organizations underestimate the cultural shift required. Precisely. We've got the budget, we've got the technology, but getting our team to embrace new workflows, that's proving to be the real challenge. Maria, joining conversation. Sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing. I'm Maria Santos from Tech Consult Solutions. We actually specialize in exactly this kind of transition management. Please join us. This is Alex, who's dealing with some of the implementation challenges I was discussing earlier. Nice to meet you, Alex. What specific resistance are you encountering? Is it generational, departmental, or more across the board? It's fascinating, actually. We assumed it would be generational, older employees resisting change, younger ones embracing it. But it's turned out to be much more complex. Some of our most experienced staff are our biggest advocates because they see how the new systems could eliminate their daily frustrations. That's a perfect example of why assumptions can derail transformation efforts. People resist change they don't understand or that they perceive threatens their job security, regardless of age. Exactly. We've found that transparency about the why behind changes is crucial. When people understand the business rationale and see how it benefits them personally, adoption rates skyrocket. We tried town halls and email communications, but I'm not sure we're getting through effectively. Have you considered peer champions? Sometimes the most effective communication comes from colleagues rather than management. Maria's absolutely right. Identify the informal influencers in each department, not necessarily the managers, but the people others naturally turn to for advice. That's brilliant. We do have those people, but we haven't been leveraging them strategically. We could actually help you identify and train those champions. It's one of our core services. I'd be very interested in learning more. Are you free for coffee sometime next week? Absolutely. Let me give you my card. This is exactly why I love these events. Real problems meeting practical solutions through genuine connections. Dr. Chen, would you be open to a brief consultation? I'd love to get your perspective on our overall strategy. I'd be happy to chat, though I should mention my consulting schedule is pretty packed through the end of the quarter. No pressure at all. Even a 30-minute phone call would be incredibly valuable. Actually, Alex, why don't I send you some case studies from similar implementations? That might help you refine your questions before talking with Dr. Chen. That's a thoughtful approach. And Alex, feel free to email me your current strategy outline. I might be able to provide some quick insights even with my schedule constraints. You're both incredibly generous. This conversation alone has given me several new directions to explore. That's what these events are for, building authentic, professional relationships rather than just collecting business cards. Speaking of which, I see the organizer trying to get my attention. Probably time for my book signing session. Of course. Thank you again for such an insightful conversation. Yes, thank you, Dr. Chen. Alex, I'll send you those case studies tomorrow morning. Perfect. Looking forward to continuing our discussion. Notice how the conversation flowed naturally from compliments to substantive business discussion, and how all three participants found ways to add value for each other. This is sophisticated networking in English. Now let's listen to an excerpt from a university lecture on environmental economics. Notice the professor's use of academic vocabulary, complex sentence structures, and how they build arguments systematically. Now let's listen to an excerpt from a university lecture on environmental economics. Notice the professor's use of academic vocabulary, complex sentence structures, and how they build arguments systematically. Good morning, everyone. Today, we're delving into one of the most contentious issues in contemporary environmental economics, the true cost of carbon pricing mechanisms and their effectiveness in driving sustainable behavior change. Now, I want you to think critically about this question. When we talk about carbon taxes or cap-and-trade systems, are we addressing the root causes of environmental degradation? Or are we simply creating elaborate accounting systems that allow business as usual to continue? Let me start with a provocative statement. Most carbon pricing schemes currently in operation are fundamentally flawed because they operate within a framework that treats environmental degradation as an externality that can be corrected through market mechanisms, rather than recognizing that infinite growth on a finite planet is inherently unsustainable. Consider the European Union's emissions trading system, the EU ETS. Launched in 2005 with great fanfare, it was heralded as a market-based solution that would harness economic incentives to drive decarbonization. The theory was elegant. Put a price on carbon, let the market determine the most cost-effective ways to reduce emissions, and voila, environmental protection through economic efficiency. But what actually happened? For the first several years, carbon prices remained stubbornly low, sometimes trading below €5 per ton. Why? Because the system was flooded with free allowances, and the economic crisis of 2008 reduced industrial activity anyway. Companies weren't changing their behavior because of the carbon price, they were simply trading permits in what amounted to a sophisticated shell game. Now, to be fair, the EU ETS has undergone significant reforms. The Market Stability Reserve, introduced in 2019, has helped to address some of the oversupply issues, and carbon prices have risen substantially, reaching over €80 per ton in 2021. But here's the crucial question. Are these price signals actually driving the structural changes we need, or are they simply making carbon-intensive activities more expensive while the fundamental business models remain unchanged? Student coughs. Let me give you a concrete example. The steel industry is one of the most carbon-intensive sectors in the global economy, responsible for approximately 7% of global CO2 emissions. Under the EU ETS, steel companies face carbon costs for their emissions. But what are their options? They can invest in more efficient production processes, which might reduce emissions by 10 to 15%. They can switch to alternative production methods, but hydrogen-based steelmaking is still technologically immature and economically unviable at scale. Or they can simply pass the carbon costs on to consumers and continue producing steel the same way they always have. What we're seeing in practice is largely the third option, combined with what economists call carbon leakage, production shifting to countries without carbon pricing, which doesn't reduce global emissions but simply moves them around. This brings us to a fundamental tension in environmental economics, the difference between theoretical elegance and practical effectiveness. Carbon pricing is theoretically sound. If you put a high enough price on carbon emissions, economic actors will find ways to reduce them. But the devil, as they say, is in the details. Let me show you some data that illustrates this point. This graph shows carbon prices in various systems worldwide versus actual emission reductions achieved. What you'll notice is that the correlation is much weaker than economic theory would predict. Why might this be? First, price signals need to be both high enough and predictable enough to justify long-term investment decisions. If companies don't know what carbon will cost in 10 years, they can't make rational decisions about investing in new technologies. Second, carbon pricing alone doesn't address market failures in innovation. Clean technologies often require massive upfront investments with uncertain returns, while fossil fuel technologies benefit from decades of accumulated learning and infrastructure investment. Third, and perhaps most importantly, carbon pricing assumes that environmental protection is simply a matter of getting the prices right. But what if our consumption patterns and growth expectations are fundamentally incompatible with planetary boundaries? This is where we encounter what I call the efficiency trap. Carbon pricing makes our current system more efficient, but it doesn't question whether that system is appropriate in the first place. It's like optimizing the fuel efficiency of cars while ignoring the possibility that we might need to fundamentally rethink transportation systems. Student question from audience, barely audible. Excellent question about complementary policies. Yes, this is exactly why most economists now argue that carbon pricing needs to be part of a broader policy package. You need regulations that set minimum standards, public investment in research and development, infrastructure policies that enable clean alternatives, and social policies that ensure the transition doesn't disproportionately burden vulnerable populations. The interesting thing is that when you start adding all these complementary policies, carbon pricing begins to look less like a market solution and more like one tool in a comprehensive planning framework, which raises philosophical questions about the role of markets versus government intervention in addressing environmental challenges. Notice how the professor builds complex arguments systematically, uses academic language naturally, and engages with counterarguments. This is the kind of analytical thinking you'll encounter in academic settings. Now let's listen to a graduate student discussion group debating the lecture we just heard. Pay attention to how students challenge each other's ideas, build on arguments, and navigate disagreement respectfully. Moderator Sarah. Okay, everyone, thanks for staying after Professor Williams' lecture. I thought we could use this time to dig deeper into some of the issues she raised. Who wants to start us off? James. I'll jump in. I found her critique of carbon pricing pretty compelling, but I think she might be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Just because current systems are imperfect doesn't mean the underlying principle is wrong. But James, that's exactly what she was arguing against, this assumption that we just need to tweak the system rather than questioning its fundamental premises. The EU ETS has been around for almost 2 decades, and we're still debating whether it's working. Michael's got a point, but I think we need to be realistic about political constraints. Carbon pricing might not be perfect, but it's one of the few climate policies that's actually been implemented at scale. The alternative isn't some ideal policy, it's probably no policy at all. Michael, I respectfully disagree. That kind of pragmatic incrementalism is exactly why we're in this mess. We keep settling for suboptimal solutions because they're politically feasible. Meanwhile, the climate crisis keeps accelerating. But Aisha, what's the alternative? Professor Williams pointed out all these problems with carbon pricing, but she didn't really offer a concrete alternative framework. Priya, actually, I think she did, implicitly. When she talked about questioning growth paradigms and consumption patterns, she was hinting at more fundamental economic restructuring. Priya, can you elaborate on what that might look like in practice? Well, think about degrowth economics, or circular economy models, or participatory planning approaches. These aren't just policy tweaks. They're alternative ways of organizing economic activity that don't assume infinite growth is possible or desirable. Okay, but now we're talking about completely restructuring the global economy. Even if these ideas are theoretically sound, how do you get from here to there without causing massive social upheaval? Maybe some upheaval is inevitable, Michael. Climate change is going to cause massive social upheaval anyway. The question is whether we manage the transition proactively or let it happen to us chaotically. James, I think you're both right to some extent, but let me push back on the either-or framing. Why can't we pursue carbon pricing improvements while also experimenting with more radical alternatives? That's an interesting point, James. Are you thinking about policy experimentation at different scales? Exactly. We could have cities or regions testing circular economy models, while national governments work on carbon pricing reforms, while international bodies explore new frameworks for global cooperation. I like that approach in theory, but I worry about the time horizon. We don't have decades to experiment. The IPCC reports are pretty clear that we need rapid, far-reaching transitions starting immediately. But Priya, rapid change requires broad social consensus, which takes time to build. If you move too fast, you risk backlash that could set back progress even further. Aisha, this is exactly the kind of debate that privileges process over outcomes. While we're worried about political feasibility, ecosystems are collapsing and people are dying from climate impacts. Aisha, I hear your urgency, and I don't think anyone here disagrees with the scale of the crisis. But how do we balance urgency with effectiveness? By being honest about what the science says and what that implies for policy. If gradual change isn't sufficient and the evidence suggests it isn't, then we need to have serious conversations about more transformative approaches. But transformative change still has to happen through existing institutions, at least initially. You can't just bypass democratic processes because they're inconveniently slow. James, I don't think anyone's suggesting bypassing democracy, but maybe we need to think more creatively about democratic participation. Citizens' assemblies, deliberative polling, participatory budgeting. There are lots of innovative approaches to democratic decision-making. Those are interesting ideas, Priya, but they're still relatively small-scale experiments. How do you scale them up to address global challenges? Sarah, maybe that's a good place to start wrapping up. It seems like we've identified some key tensions: urgency versus feasibility, incremental versus transformative change, local experimentation versus global coordination, and the fundamental question of whether market-based solutions are adequate for addressing challenges that might require post-market thinking. Right. I guess my takeaway is that we need multiple approaches running in parallel because we don't know which ones will prove most effective. I agree with parallel approaches, but I think we also need to be honest about which approaches are more likely to achieve the scale of change that's actually required. Fair enough. Maybe our next discussion should focus on specific case studies where different approaches have been tried. Great idea, Michael. I'll send around some readings for next week that explore both market-based and alternative approaches in practice. Notice how the students engaged with complex ideas, challenged each other respectfully, and built sophisticated arguments collaboratively. This is the kind of academic discourse that requires advanced listening skills. Now let's listen to a dinner party conversation where friends discuss current events, share personal experiences, and navigate cultural differences. Notice the informal register, cultural references, and how conversation topics shift naturally. Host, David. All right, everyone, please dig in while it's hot. The salmon should be perfectly flaky, and Maria, I made sure the vegetables are completely plant-based for you. Maria, you're an absolute angel. This looks incredible. And honestly, after the week I've had, I desperately needed good food and better company. Rough week at work? I feel like everyone's been saying that lately. Is it just me, or does it feel like the whole world's been a bit chaotic recently? Jennifer, you're not wrong. Between the supply chain issues, the political situation, and now this latest environmental report, I feel like we're living through one of those interesting times that the old curse talks about. You know, Carlos, I was just reading about that Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. Turns out, it's not actually Chinese at all. It's a Western invention that we attributed to Chinese wisdom because it sounded profound. Seriously? That's fascinating and slightly embarrassing. How many other ancient wisdom quotes are just modern inventions? Probably more than we'd like to admit. Remember that whole Gandhi never said most of the quotes attributed to him thing that went viral a few years ago? Speaking of things going viral, did anyone else see that documentary about social media manipulation? I watched it last weekend, and honestly, it left me questioning everything I think I know about current events. The social dilemma? Yeah, that was pretty eye-opening, though I have to say, some of their claims seemed a bit hyperbolic. I thought so too, but then I started paying attention to my own behavior, and it was kind of scary how accurate their predictions were. I realized I was getting most of my news from algorithm-curated feeds without even thinking about it. That's exactly what worries me. We talk about doing our own research, but most of us are just researching within echo chambers that confirm what we already believe. True, but what's the alternative? Traditional media has its own biases and corporate interests. At least with social media, you can potentially access diverse perspectives if you're intentional about it. Key word being intentional. Most people aren't, though. They just follow the path of least resistance, which usually means consuming information that's emotionally satisfying rather than necessarily accurate. It reminds me of something my grandmother used to say about gossip in small towns. She'd say, people don't repeat stories because they're true. They repeat them because they're interesting. That's brilliant, Maria. And now we have global small towns where rumors can spread to millions of people in hours. The scale is definitely unprecedented, but I wonder if the fundamental human psychology is really that different. Haven't people always been drawn to sensational stories over nuanced analysis? Probably, but the consequences are different now. When gossip stayed within small communities, the damage was limited. Now, misinformation can influence elections, public health decisions, even international relations. That's what makes me nostalgic for simpler times, even though I know that's probably just rose-colored glasses. My parents' generation didn't have to worry about fact-checking every news story they read. Though, to be fair, Maria, they also had much less access to information overall. There's something to be said for having the ability to cross-reference sources and hear multiple perspectives, even if it requires more effort. True, and despite all the challenges, I still think we're better off with more information access than less. The solution isn't to go back to gatekeepers controlling what we can know. I agree, but maybe we need better tools for navigating information abundance. Digital literacy should be taught as rigorously as traditional literacy. Absolutely. My nephew is in middle school, and they're starting to teach critical thinking about online sources. It gives me hope that the next generation might be better equipped to handle this environment. Though they're also growing up as digital natives, so they might be more susceptible to manipulation because they trust technology more intuitively. Interesting point. My daughter is always fact-checking things I tell her by looking them up on her phone, but she rarely questions the credibility of the sources she finds. That's exactly the kind of skill we need to cultivate, not just the ability to find information, but the judgment to evaluate its reliability. On that philosophical note, should we open another bottle of wine? I feel like we've earned it after solving all the world's information problems. Please. And David, this salmon really is perfectly cooked. You'll have to share the recipe. Trade secret, I'm afraid. But I might be persuaded to reveal it in exchange for Maria's famous chocolate chip cookies. Deal. Though fair warning, my cookies come with a lecture about sustainable cocoa sourcing. Wouldn't have it any other way, Maria. Guilt-free cookies taste better anyway. Finally, let's listen to a podcast discussion about cultural identity in globalized societies. Pay attention to how the hosts manage a complex topic with multiple perspectives. Host 1, Rachel. Welcome back to Global Perspectives, the podcast where we explore how local communities navigate an increasingly connected world. I'm Rachel Martinez. And I'm Jonathan Liu. Today, we're diving into a question that's become increasingly relevant in our globalized society. How do people maintain cultural identity while participating in global communities? It's a fascinating tension, Jonathan. On one hand, we have unprecedented opportunities to connect with people from different backgrounds, share ideas, and create new hybrid cultures. On the other hand, there's real concern about cultural homogenization and the loss of local traditions. Exactly. And what makes this particularly complex is that cultural identity itself isn't static. It's always been evolving, but the pace of change today is extraordinary. Let's start with a personal perspective. Jonathan, you grew up in a Chinese-American household. How did you navigate questions of cultural identity? It's interesting, Rachel, because my experience was probably pretty typical for second-generation immigrants, but it felt completely unique at the time. At home, we spoke Mandarin, celebrated traditional holidays, and followed certain cultural practices. But at school and with friends, I was fully immersed in American culture. Did that feel conflicted, or more like you were bilingual in cultures as well as languages? Both, honestly. Sometimes it felt like I was living parallel lives that didn't quite connect. I remember being embarrassed by some Chinese traditions when I was younger, but then feeling guilty about that embarrassment. That guilt suggests a deep emotional connection to your heritage, even when you were struggling with it. Absolutely. And what's interesting is how my perspective has evolved. In my 20s, I went through a phase of really embracing my Chinese identity, partly as a reaction to feeling like I'd neglected it. But now I think I have a more integrated sense of being both Chinese and American, rather than feeling like I have to choose. That evolution seems really common. I've noticed similar patterns in my own Mexican-American family. But here's what I find fascinating. Global connectivity has actually made it easier to maintain connections to heritage cultures. How so? Well, my grandparents who immigrated to the US were essentially cut off from their communities in Mexico. Communication was difficult, travel was expensive, and there weren't many ways to stay connected to cultural developments back home. But today, my cousins who live here follow Mexican politics in real time, stay in touch with extended family daily, and even participate in cultural events virtually. That's such a good point. Technology has made cultural maintenance much more feasible. My parents can watch Chinese news, participate in Chinese social media, and even attend virtual cultural events. They're more connected to contemporary Chinese culture now than they were 30 years ago. But that raises another question. Is the culture they're connecting to the same culture they left behind? Cultures evolve whether we're there or not. Absolutely. My parents sometimes feel disconnected from modern China because their cultural reference points are from when they emigrated. Meanwhile, my Chinese cousins who never left think some of our preserved traditions are outdated. That's such a complex dynamic. You're preserving a version of culture that might be frozen in time while the original culture continues evolving. Exactly. And then you have third-generation kids who might be rediscovering traditions that their parents rejected but that their grandparents valued. Cultural identity becomes this layered, non-linear process. Speaking of complexity, let's talk about cultural fusion. We're seeing entirely new cultural expressions emerging from global interactions. K-pop is probably the most obvious example. It's recognizably Korean, but incorporates elements from American pop, European electronic music, and other global influences. And it's created this fascinating phenomenon where kids in Latin America are learning Korean not because they have Korean heritage, but because they're passionate about the culture they've discovered through music and media. That challenges traditional notions of cultural belonging, doesn't it? Cultural identity is no longer just about ethnicity or geography, it can be about affinity and choice. Right, though that raises questions about cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. When does borrowing elements from other cultures become problematic? That's where intention and context matter so much. Are you engaging with another culture respectfully, trying to understand it deeply? Or are you just extracting elements that seem exotic or trendy? And power dynamics are crucial too. When dominant cultures borrow from marginalized ones without acknowledgement or understanding, that's different from cross-cultural exchange between equals. Exactly. But navigating those dynamics requires incredible cultural sensitivity, which isn't always easy to develop, especially when cultures themselves are internally diverse. There's no single spokesperson for any cultural group who can give permission or set boundaries. That's such an important point. We often talk about Chinese culture or Mexican culture as if they're monolithic, but they're incredibly diverse internally. And globalization has made that diversity even more complex. You have urban versus rural variations, generational differences, class distinctions, and now global versus local orientations all intersecting. So maybe the question isn't how to preserve cultural purity, but how to maintain cultural vitality while allowing for evolution and fusion. I like that framing. Cultural vitality suggests something living and dynamic, rather than something that needs to be protected in amber. And it acknowledges that cultures have always been hybrid. The idea of pure, authentic cultures is largely mythical anyway. True. Even traditional practices usually have histories of borrowing and adaptation that we've forgotten over time. So maybe what we're experiencing now isn't fundamentally different from what's always happened. It's just happening faster and more visibly, and with more conscious awareness. Previous generations might not have thought explicitly about cultural identity in the way we do now. That consciousness has benefits and drawbacks. It allows for more intentional cultural preservation, but it can also create anxiety about authenticity and belonging. Speaking of belonging, we should probably acknowledge that not everyone has the luxury of choosing their cultural identity. For many people, cultural identity is imposed by how others perceive them, regardless of their personal preferences. Absolutely. Racial and ethnic categorization often determines how people are treated, regardless of their cultural self-identification. And that external categorization can force people into culture boxes that don't reflect their actual experiences or preferences. Which brings us back to the importance of letting people define their own cultural identities rather than having them imposed from outside. Though that requires a level of social acceptance that we haven't fully achieved yet. True, but I do think we're moving in that direction, especially among younger generations who seem more comfortable with complex, multiple identities. I hope so. The world is complex enough without adding artificial restrictions on how people can understand themselves. On that optimistic note, let's wrap up today's discussion. Jonathan, any final thoughts? Just that cultural identity will probably continue evolving in ways we can't predict. The key is maintaining openness to that evolution while preserving what's meaningful to us. Beautifully said. Thanks to our listeners for joining this exploration of cultural identity in a global world. We'll be back next week with a discussion about language preservation in digital environments. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep celebrating the beautiful complexity of human culture. Noticed how the hosts managed a nuanced discussion, incorporated personal experiences, and addressed multiple perspectives while maintaining intellectual rigor throughout. Congratulations! You've just completed one of the most challenging listening practice sessions we've ever produced. Over the past hour, you've been exposed to authentic English in professional, academic, and social contexts, the kind of language you'll encounter in real-world situations requiring advanced communication skills. Let's acknowledge what you've just achieved. You followed complex multi-party conversations, understood academic argumentation, and navigated cultural discussions with sophisticated vocabulary and nuanced perspectives. Even if you didn't catch every word, and you probably didn't, you've exercised the kind of listening skills that separate intermediate learners from truly fluent speakers. In the business contexts, you heard how professionals navigate disagreement, build collaborative solutions, and manage complex projects across cultural and geographical boundaries. This isn't textbook English. This is how English actually functions in international business environments. The academic segments challenged you with formal register, abstract concepts, and the kind of analytical discourse you'll encounter in university settings or professional development contexts. You heard how ideas develop through structured argument and how students engage critically with complex material. The social conversations demonstrated how English speakers navigate cultural topics, share personal experiences, and maintain relationships while discussing potentially sensitive subjects. Throughout today's session, successful comprehension depended on several advanced listening strategies. Context-dependent comprehension, understanding meaning from situational context rather than catching every individual word. Speaker tracking, following multiple voices in group conversations and understanding how different speakers build on each other's ideas. Register recognition, distinguishing between formal academic language, professional business communication, and casual social interaction. Cultural inference, understanding implied meanings, cultural references, and social dynamics that aren't explicitly stated. Argument following, tracking how complex ideas develop through multiple speakers and across extended discourse. Today's session has probably highlighted areas where your listening skills can continue developing. Processing speed. Advanced English speakers process language in real time without translation. If you found yourself trying to translate, focus on developing direct comprehension. Vocabulary and context. Unknown words shouldn't derail comprehension. Practice understanding general meaning even when specific vocabulary is unfamiliar. Cultural competence. Many nuances in today's conversations depended on cultural knowledge. Continue building familiarity with English-speaking cultures. Sustained attention. Hour-long listening sessions require mental stamina that develops with practice. Use today's session as a benchmark for your current listening ability. If you understood 60 to 70% of the content, you're operating at a solid intermediate level. If you caught 80% or more, you're approaching advanced proficiency. For continued development, seek out similar authentic content, business podcasts, university lectures, social discussions. The key is regular exposure to unmodified English at natural speaking speed. Remember that listening comprehension at this level isn't about perfection, it's about functional understanding. Native speakers don't catch every word in complex conversations either. They use the same contextual strategies you've been practicing today. Your willingness to engage with challenging content is what will ultimately drive your progress toward advanced proficiency. Every difficult conversation you navigate, every complex lecture you follow, every cultural nuance you understand adds to your communicable competence. Thank you for taking on today's challenge. Your commitment to pushing beyond comfortable content is what separates students who achieve true fluency from those who remain at intermediate plateaus. Keep challenging yourself, keep engaging with authentic content, and remember, you're not just learning English, you're developing the communication skills for full participation in global English-speaking communities. This is Taylor, congratulating you on completing advanced listening practice that will serve you well in real-world English communication. Until next time, keep pushing your boundaries.